And now I'd like to welcome Mike Lombardi.
All right, welcome, folks. Thanks for everybody joining here. And I want to get my panel up here as well. I will be moderating this panel. We're going to be talking about North Korean IT workers and some of both the technical and legal considerations in getting into this. So let me make sure I know which slide we're on here. Okay, perfect. So UNC 5267, I'm sure everybody here has heard of North Korea. You may have heard some of the other known as groups there that you see. UNC 5267 is a little bit different in the sense that we have characterized this group as one that is seeking to gain a paycheck. Now, we'll talk a little bit about some of the follow-on activities after they're detected and kicked out, and we've seen some ramp up in extortion activities after that. But the primary goal is really to collect a paycheck, and often from multiple employers at a single time. And that revenue generation is really to fund their weapons of mass destruction program. With that, I'd like my panel to introduce itself before we get into a brief history and then dive into the questions here. So starting with Evan on the far side there from Aiken Gump.
Hi, I'm Evan Wolf. I'm a partner and co-chair of the privacy and cyber practice at Aiken Gump. I've been a cybersecurity lawyer for 18 years, and in the 10 years before that, I had an honest living as a hacker for the U.S. government and at the MITRE Corporation. And just to dispel the awkwardness, until about 7 weeks ago, my partners, Matt and Caroline, are sitting next to me before I switched to another law firm. But they're still friends.
Go ahead.
And Matt?
Yeah, hey, I'm Matt Welling. I'm a partner in the privacy and cyber practice at Crowell. Similarly, I have a technical background before I traded that in to become a lawyer. Really kind of spend a lot of time on the response side, doing investigations, and then taking those lessons and helping companies think proactively about how to address these issues.
And Caroline.
Caroline Brown. I'm a partner in Crowell Moring's Washington, D.C. office. I sit in both our white collar groups, our international trade and national security groups. And so I primarily function on the intersection of economic security and national security and international trade. And I'm very honored to be included on this panel. I don't know the technical pieces, but I do know the sanctions pieces. And so that's what you're going to be hearing from me in this discussion. And before joining Crowell, I was in the U.S. government for a little bit over a decade, working in DOJ's National Security Division, and then at the Department of the Treasury, working with both OFAC and FinCEN.
Great. So with that, let's just kind of bring people up to speed. How did we get to know UNC 5267 and where we are today with them? So Mandiant started tracking this threat group back in 22 and started to see activities sort of clustering around this sort of employment scheme. And this was about the same time that the government issued its first advisory around this sort of IT worker scheme. In October of 2023, my neighbor just down the street, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, was arrested well, actually she wasn't arrested, they took her laptops because it was one of the first laptop farms that was facilitating this kind of scheme in Litchfield Park, which is just down I-10 from Phoenix. It took the law enforcement a little while to get through all of the material that they had seized, but they did end up charging her in that May to December timeframe, while the U.S. law enforcement was also indicting a number of IT workers. During the same time, we issued our first blog on the DPRK IT worker scheme, and there's quite a few indicators of compromise in there that folks started hunting for. And they did call us and ask us to investigate a variety of those. And I typically sit across 3 to 5 engagements at any given time. I've got a team of incident responders based in either Arizona or Southern California of about 20 or so. We're working a variety of different cases, some of which were these IT worker scams. So clearly, my team isn't the only one working on it. all of Mandiant is. We bring to bear some additional reporting on it in April of 25. And then it gets interesting in June and July of this year. There are 21 different seizures of laptop farms out there. Chapman pleads guilty. And the U.S. government indicts and sanctions a variety of organizations. And to this day, we are still getting inquiries into these types of schemes, although not as much as what we saw in 24. So with that, let's get into our panel discussion. And for our esteemed panel here, as it relates to ensuring that you don't necessarily hire one in the first place, what are some of the red flags that organizations should be looking out for during the recruitment process?
I'm happy I'm happy to kick things off, and then I'm sure Matt has some good ideas as well. But I mean, it has to start with thinking about sort of the people and then the technology that the person's using, and starting with the person. It's things like the email hasn't been listed, isn't known by any credential brokers. Because has anyone in the room never received a letter saying that they've been hacked? Well, every email should have some credentials behind it. And if they don't, and that's something you can publicly find out, to who are the LinkedIns. They use reuse resumes, they reuse contacts. So you start off with that part of it, and then even at the interview phase, you can start identifying things that technically look off in terms of if they're not going off video, if you ask them irregular or unexpected questions. Which I'm a fan of, irregular and unexpected questions. Can they answer them well, or do they answer them awkwardly, or sometimes do they hang up on you? And so I think there are a few things like that you can do that begin the process. But ultimately, I used to say when we were working on a lot of these cases, they seem to be more HR than cyber and IT initially. So, but I'll turn over to Matt.
Yeah, I think that's right. A big part of it, I would say, is looking at pieces of information that don't seem to go together. One of the big indicators, for example, is the address on their ID for their employment verification and all that, and the address where they want you to send things are often different. Looking at kind of those disparate pieces of information that are, they'll very often have a story for why this is. It's practiced, but if you look at it and kind of pull back across your candidate pool, that's an unusual situation relatively. On the unusual and unexpected questions, that really is a great one going on camera, but it can be things that are sort of in the rapport building sort. So one of the examples I've seen quite a bit is to pick something off their resume, often they're, kind of large state schools or whatever, is, oh, I see you went to the, University of South Carolina, go Cornhuskers. And look for the response, because it's the type of thing they're not prepared for, that anybody that has gone to a big public university in the United States tends to know the mascot. That one's not right, and just engage in the reaction from there.
I agree, and our investigations are different in the sense that normally you bring Mandiant in and they're looking for technical indicators. How did they get in? Where did they move? What are the compromised accounts? What are the compromised systems? And this is an insider case. So we're going to absolutely be focused on that laptop. But the other thing that we ask for is a lot of what Evan and Matt just mentioned as it relates to the vetting documents. What does their application look like? Who's their emergency contact? Is their emergency contact somebody that we already have on our list of folks who, we know are working in a different organization? One of the interesting victim notifications that we put out there a while back was one in which I'm an IT worker, I'm co-employed at a variety of organizations, and I'm still looking for the next job, right? Well, where am I looking for that next job? Which system am I using to perhaps do that? It's probably on one of my employer's systems. And so we've found some interesting ways in which to start to pull on additional threads as it relates to those kinds of things. So, technical indicators are ones where, and again, it's on the blog, remote access tools. So anything that's legitimate, certainly. So log me in, TeamViewer, AnyDesk. There's a big set of systems that were using that. Astral VPN was kind of the dead giveaway for a long time. By a show of hands, how are folks on running a modern EDR? If you think you're running a modern EDR, raise your hand. Modern EDR would be like a Falcon, a Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, SentinelOne, and some of these may have given your organization indicators to potentially search for. We'll get into some more of that in a little bit, but if we have one, and we know now that we do, I know that there are some legal considerations around what to do next. And Caroline, I think you have some thoughts on if we find out what that we have one, what we should be thinking about.
Right. Well, compounding this risk and the world that Evan and Matt live in is another vulnerability, right? And that's whether or not you've directly or indirectly provided any sort of payment or technology or material assistance to North Korea, right, or any North Korean national, and that's going to trigger your sanctions liability, potential sanctions liability, right? So just taking a step back, North Korea is subject to a comprehensive embargo by the United States, meaning that U.S. persons, U.S. companies can't have any interaction at all, again, either directly or indirectly with North Korean persons. And so if you were to find out that you did have this situation and you were providing payment or had provided payment, that could potentially be an additional violation and that you have violated the prohibitions on any sorts of dealings with North Koreans. There could also be, it could impose either civil liability or potential criminal liability if it was referred to the Department of Justice. There's also potential exposure to violations of export controls, depending on whether or not you provided, what sorts of goods and services and technology you've shared with the North Korean entity. So not only are you dealing with this other risk area, but now you've got to start thinking about your sanctions exposure, how to implement some controls against that, and what to do next. And I'll save that part for another part of the discussion.
So one of the things that we're used to running on is a very fast timeline. What about pay periods? Or, okay, I find out on a Wednesday, payday's on Friday. Do I as an organization need to make decisions that quickly from it continuing to say issue a paycheck to some?
Sure. So this is where it's really fact specific and it depends on risk tolerance. And this is when you want to call your favorite sanctions attorney and have a little discussion about what your potential exposure might be to sanctions violations if you were to proceed with that payment. Right. So of course you've got some considerations in the HR space about withholding payment, but if you were to go through and process that payment, it ends up that as a North Korean, then you need to think about what sort of liability you've exposed yourself to. And there's really kind of two hooks here, right? So one is OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is in the Department of the Treasury, which is the primary administrator of U.S. sanctions, could hold you liable for causing a U.S. financial institution for violating sanctions. So your payment processor, your payment partner, your bank, that's a U.S. entity. If they process that payment, they have directly violated sanctions. You may be causing them to violate sanctions, and that creates exposure for you as well. The other hook is material support, right? So OFAC could find that you have either knowingly or unknowingly provided material support to North Korea by paying these entities. And the unique thing, well, at least one thing to consider when it comes to sanctions is that it's strict liability. And that means that it doesn't turn on whether you knew that this individual was affiliated with North Korea or not. It's strict liability, right? So if you have violated sanctions, you don't get off the hook just because you didn't know at the time who that entity was on the other end of the payment.
And so, Matt and Evan, how do you help clients kind of prepare for a situation like this or react to it when they do?
Oh, if I could just jump on one thing now that Caroline has effectively and sufficiently scared you all, as you should be, around the implications of this. If you detect them after they're there and you've started the payment cycle, or they're far enough along the process, as as sort of I counsel companies, how you react depends where you are in the process. Because if you're just detecting them when you're screening, or maybe as they made it through the interview process and they've actually talked to someone, or you actually have both paper, or if you're smart enough, or your system allows you to collect IP addresses and other things during the employment process, then you should be thinking about working at FBI. And I'm, as someone who spent the 4 years at the Department of Homeland Security, which is sometimes known as the enemy combatant of the FBI, I am not always a fan of the FBI, but in this case, they are incredibly effective at running sort of together programs and a working group that many of our collective clients up here are a part of, that can stop and sort of share intel and information that allow us to stop at that sort of pre-employment screening process. If they're already an employee, whether you've shipped them a laptop or whether you've given them access to your system, it has to be handled differently. And if you've obviously paid them, do everything Carolyn just said. But if you haven't yet, you do need to think about, whether or not this is a cyber incident, what information they've had access to. Do you need to tell? You need to think about reviewing your IRP and other sort of, this is where it becomes sort of an awkward HR and cyber matter at the same time. And so you need to think about, does this trigger any of your notification requirements contractually or from a regulatory perspective? Do you have to think about sort of notifying internally? I mean, I don't think I've seen an 8K yet around this. I don't know if anyone else up here has, but eventually these risks get larger because the amount of notifications that the government is doing in this space is pretty significant.
Yeah, I think one of the challenging points for companies that are dealing with this is nobody tells you this person is definitely a North Korean, especially at these early stages. Instead, you're piecing together information. Maybe you've gotten an Overwatch alert from CrowdStrike that very helpfully just says, please call us. Maybe you've been tipped off by one of your, partners by something strange going on in the way they're behaving. Like these often come up much more like HR investigations than they do a cyber incident, right? Like we get there for all the reasons that Evan just mentioned, but they don't necessarily arise in that kind of traditional incident kind of touch and feel. And then on top of it, you're dealing with imperfect information even as it's coming in. So you're making all these decisions without kind of having the answer. So that's why having an incident response plan, having, insider investigation, other HR policies can really be that framework that you lean on at a time like this. So even if you're not making every decision perfectly at that moment, you're doing it in a programmatic, repeatable way that you can substantiate, that was developed sort of thoughtfully based on, whatever leading practices or appropriate frameworks are right for your organization. That having those plans, and better yet, having practiced those plans, really gives you, somewhat of a leg to stand on as you're figuring these things out, that you're acting reasonably, that you're acting timely, while you're making these sometimes very challenging decisions. And, that's to your point about preparedness, that's really a big way that you can start preparing, is looking at your existing plans and policies. Are you ready for this? And if not, work on those now instead of, when you're getting these calls.
And I'll do a friendly intercept in that I think there was a tech glitch when Matt was talking. I thought I heard him say, just call Mandiant, not the other company during the incident response. But no, I mean, I think there's also, and I think we'll talk about it later, some specific technologies that you should be keen on looking at. And this is where, Mandiant and all the forensic firms have been super helpful on sort of thinking about, whether it's, keyboard video and mouse, remote switches and things like that are, normal employees don't do those things. Normal employees don't use Tailscale and use sort of mesh VPNs. And that's where there are things that you should absolutely be looking for that are, I won't say like 100% indicators, but more strongly indicative of.
Yeah, for sure. So the modern EDRs are really helpful from two primary characteristics. It's network connections and it's running processes. And so what do I mean by that is, the VPNs how are they connecting in, and what are they connecting to, i.e. some of these remote access tools. That will give you a strong indication as to, hey, do I have remote access on a system that isn't using our company's, or our company hasn't even blessed a single one. Likewise, understanding some of the underlying hardware connections, so logging USB device connections and the like, such that we can detect some of the KVM activity and when was this first installed and the like. In addition to that, these folks have a job, right? And they're supposed to be doing something. This is why they were unfortunately hired in the first place. Well, have their duties just been to perform that job, or have they kind of strayed outside? So what's that? That's the logs. That's the logs in terms of where else are they supposed to be accessing. Did they just access those things under their normal day-to-day, or did they happen to go outside those boundaries, and are there logs to help color that picture in as completely as we possibly can? Oftentimes these folks are software developers, and so they're going to do code commits. Those code commits, in my experience, have been just fine. I think we found one vulnerability, and it was really just because it was poor coding. And Mandiant's proactive services will come in, they'll look at all those code commits, say, okay, yeah, this is fine. Oh, by the way, they introduced a vulnerability over here, so you guys want to fix that. But there wasn't anything malicious insofar as a backdoor, which is a question that many customers are concerned about. So again, this stuff takes time to investigate, and I'm curious how you've advised clients insofar as how to keep a pretense potentially going such that we don't end up with the IT worker ceasing to cooperate, that we can potentially get that laptop back and even provide deeper forensics or at least keep it online. So how do you help clients kind of keep that conversation and the ruse alive while we get to a point of either definitiveness?
Well, I'll take this one first. I think one of the interesting things in working these investigations is these threat actors don't act like kind of your prototypical threat actor where they get discovered and they throw the laptop in the dumpster and run away. More often than not, I've seen these actors be extremely cooperative, right? They're trying to stretch it out to get one more paycheck or to collect severance or whatever it is, up to and including have had examples where it wasn't them, but they paid somebody to walk the laptop back into a company depot, right, in an effort to get that severance payment. That said, it's important to, keep the interaction alive. A lot of it is just, hey, we're having a technical issue. We're working to resolve your account, whatever. But a big piece of it is just staying communicative and trying to keep them communicating back. I'd say a lot of this is going to be based on touch and feel, but I don't know, Evan, if you've seen other examples.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Matt said. I think there's really the issue of, what is the exposure of the company in terms of what has the threat actor seen, if they're, and this is where we are seeing a shift, and to ask the questions to Michael is, really, are they just there to get a paycheck? Are they there to actually do cyber stuff? Are they trying to steal data? Are they trying to get access to systems and credentials and learn about networks? Because I think we are seeing a shift in how, the Trala or whatever number you want to use for them, is really acting, and that they've realized that, yes, they can make, billions and lots of money in this, but they can also gather data that's equally as valuable. And so really you have to think about the investigation, and this is where it's not strictly a cyber investigation. I see many great CISOs in the audience here, and if you have an FTP or a firewall that gets popped or something that an EDR picks up on, then that's easy to do. In this case, you have to be working, and this is where I'll say awkwardly, with HR, because a lot of CISOs don't work with Workday or don't understand the totality of the data that you're collecting, and these are unusual indicators. It doesn't present like a cyber issue, so you need to think about investigating it differently, and some of that means, and I since Matt and I have a decade-long history of agreeing and disagreeing on things, sometimes you do want to be patient and try to get data out of them, and sometimes I will say, your duty, your fiduciary duties to your shareholders, not to the federal government, get them out as quickly as possible. If you can brick your machine and sort of cut their access out, maybe that's better. I think there is a shift, and where I'll disagree with me and agree with Matt is that, the volume that companies are facing, even if you've gotten rid of one of them or 50 of them, they keep on coming. And that's really where, you do need to think about this as an intelligence problem and go to like Mandiant. I work with Nisos that also specializes in this space as well. There are a lot of good companies out there that do this, but that's where this is, this is this weird sort of Reese's Pieces moment of HR meets cyber, and cyber's the chocolate. So just there.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting parts about this is if you read a lot of the research out there, a lot of these groups are operating much more like organized crime than they are the military, right? It's not kind of strict regimented where they have a single way they do things that gets repeated over and over. You see a lot of iteration, some creativity, and you'll see variation in it, which is why the intelligence gathering piece can be very important. I agree with Evan. There are certainly fact patterns where you want to slam the door. Kind of the clearest one we've run into a few times lately is it's a different person that shows up on the first day of work than during the interview, a visually completely different person. You probably want to slam the door there and kind of get things cleaned up, quickly in those instances versus somebody where maybe it's not as clear cut. But gathering that information is important, and working with partners like Mandiant to stay current on the indicators, on the behaviors is incredibly important with these groups, because we're really seeing them iterate on exactly how they're doing things, because they're aware of these efforts to find them, and it's in their interest to kind of try to stay ahead of it. And you can read about the incentives and how these groups are built up, but they're all individually incentivized to keep getting these jobs, to keep collecting these paychecks, or performing what other activities are out there. And there's questions about, are they sidelining as sort of more traditional cyber criminals now, and all sorts of things. But if you're not engaging with your partners in the community, it's really hard to stay up to date on all that information, which makes a very pernicious problem that much more difficult to be addressing over time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we've seen the evolution into extortion in certain cases, and I think part of it also has to do with your threat model. So, what industry are you in? And clearly, North Koreans are interested in cryptocurrency, and that would, I think, elicit a much swifter response than, say, somebody who's in the hospitality industry. But you also have to look at it from, is this day one of the employment, or is this day 100 of the employment? What's the relationship with the manager? Do they go on camera with them? Have they produced okay code, no code, good code? We've had some investigations where it hasn't necessarily been DPRK, but it has been a co-employment. And those folks, you'll see them bounce around. They may even hand the job off at the end of the day to a different individual. So there's a lot of different nuances that can come into play as it relates to, again, more of this human aspect of it than what Mandiant very often is known for, which is really just, hey, yes, we've got great threat intel, but it is more around technical indicators as opposed to the 6'7" guy who weighs 140 pounds and whose name and picture don't really map up with what you would expect to be from just a pure ethnicity standpoint, if I can say that. We've got somebody now that we think, do we bring law enforcement in right away, or do we wait until we've kind of vetted this person out a little bit more? When's the right time?
I mean, it kind of, I hate to say this on a panel, but it depends.
Let you take that one.
And I'm gonna sort of use the two disclaimers that every law panel and every panel with 3 lawyers in DC has, which is first of all, don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, and also none of this is considered legal advice. But you first need to understand sort of what is your historic stance when it comes to this threat actor. So for example, to use the thing that every cyber panel has to mention, AI, every company is sitting on a treasure trove of intelligence data in terms of how they're being targeted, who has potentially targeted them in the past. This is where please check with your lawyers if this is a part of your role to mine the historic, applications and who was there, because I bet you each company has one or more remote IT workers that meet this demographic. And all you have to do is search your internal and your previous employment roles to find it. The problem is, what do you do when you find that? There's no legal notification requirement. It's helpful if you share information with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, but that's where it gets to sort of what Carolyn was talking about. The further down the process, if they are 1 day or 100 days, if you've paid them not at all, or you've paid them a large amount of money, that's where the risk comes, and you need to think about risk to the company and the benefit to the FBI, and working with what is the national security motivation of many of your company, and then honestly have a triad and speak to your lawyers.
And one other angle I want to think about here is, in addition to notification to law enforcement, to the FBI and what have you, it's also whether or not any of this rises to the level of requiring a voluntary self-disclosure to OFAC, right? And so we've seen a new trend in industry, and that increasingly companies are electing to make VSDs or voluntary disclosures to OFAC. That doesn't necessarily mean that a violation of sanctions or export controls, if you're notifying commerce, has taken place. It's signaling to them that there may have been a violation. You're looking into it. That's what we refer to as an initial VSD, which sometimes is just as simple as an email to OFAC, right, like through your sanctions counsel, saying, we think this may have occurred, we're going to look into it. That preserves, what the carrot is here is that OFAC has a couple of different enforcement options available to it. One can be a cautionary letter, where it just says, thank you for letting us know, please put in place the appropriate controls. That's non-public. There's also civil penalties, right? And then, of course, there's criminal referrals. But the carrot to a VSD is that you automatically get a 50% reduction off of any civil penalty, right? So that's an incentive to go in voluntarily rather than have OFAC knock on your door and ask questions. And if OFAC and the Treasury Department finds out about this from the FBI, from law enforcement, from another US government agency, you don't get the benefit of that mitigation credit, right? So you'll still have to go through the same exercise, the same questions and responses to OFAC, the same sort of scrutiny, but you don't have any, you don't have the 50% reduction off of a penalty should OFAC choose to apply a penalty to the scenario. So there's a huge incentive to go in voluntarily. Again, we're seeing more companies choose to do that. And it's a two-step process. It doesn't mean that you have to have your investigation already done and concluded and wrapped up and tied with a bow. It just means that you have identified certain activity that might be a violation. You're looking into it, right? Then you follow that up with a report later on.
And so to that end, instead of, hey, when do we bring the FBI in? What if the FBI comes to the organization and says, hey, I've got a notification for you. We've got these indicators. They may be quite light, but we do think that you've got somebody working for you from the DPRK. How does that kind of change things in terms of how an organization should react, as well as potentially self-report, or has that horse already left the barn and they're not going to be availed the VSD?
So I'm going to take a line from Evan and say it depends. Apologies for saying that. It really depends on what that cooperation agreement is with the Bureau, right? And if they already have informed OFAC about the occurrence or the possibility that there is some sort of interaction with North Korea, or if they haven't, right? And so OFAC is going to take all of that into consideration. And another mitigating factor that OFAC considers, right, and this is separate and apart from whether or not a company goes in voluntarily, is whether or not there is any sort of sanctions compliance program in place and whether or not any due diligence was performed. So circling back to the top of the converswhen we were talking about different sorts of things you can be on the lookout for, looking for red flags, conducting your diligence. All of that is stuff that OFAC is going to consider when it's examining a situation, saying, okay, what sort of controls were in place? What did the company do beforehand? Did it have sanctions screening, for example, which is a really easy process. Even if that screening didn't pick up the fact that this individual did have a nexus in North Korea, was there a screening process in place, right? There's certain things that OFAC will look at as mitigating factors, voluntarily disclosing is one, but also the due diligence that's been conducted and the controls is another. And that carries a lot of weight with OFAC, is what steps did the company take beforehand to try to guard against this very occurrence from happening.
Evan, you got some thoughts?
And since Matt and I are both professors when we're out lawyering, I'll take the first of our professorial moments and say, to give out some homework to people, because you need to be prepared for that knock on the door from the FBI. And the first thing you have to do is make sure you have an appropriate response team. It can't just be sort of the CISO and a lawyer and maybe someone from the appropriate business. You need to include HR, and that means your incident response plan probably needs to be revised. Because I'm not going to ask people for raising their hands, but most cyber incident response plans don't cover this type of investigation. Don't think about the types of data you need to have. So that's the first thing that you should do to prepare, is think about it at sort of, do you have the right team? Do you have the right paper, the right process? And then do you have the technology? Go through and do whether it's a tabletop simulation, something that sort of every company should be doing and doing one around this, but can you actually collect the right data off your Workday enclave or whatever your enterprise HR enclave is to actually be able to identify, unexpected activities, whether it's IP masking or other things. So that's the thing that I see companies doing now. Unfortunately, they're doing it afterwards, not before. And since we can speak collectively, we're all about preventative activities up here. So that's the thing that companies should do to be prepared. Because if you have remote IT workers, you will get notified. I mean, it's just, we've seen some of the smartest and best companies in the world fall victim to this, and companies that to be honest, were shocking to us, but it's just a matter of, we just haven't, just like the early days of cyber, when we didn't think about sharing indicators of compromise, we haven't thought about how to share this information and collect this information.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, if I could jump on there. Often when you're getting notified by the FBI, and our experience, it's historic, right? It's information that they've come across while building an investigation and whatnot. And the dwell time for these workers often isn't, months and years and years. It's shorter for various reasons, right? They get fired because they're doing a bad job, or for the 10th time they have to go, save their dad's restaurant in Russia, whatever it might be. And those are all stories we've heard. So it's somebody that's been terminated or is left or whatever. So when you get that notification, it's understanding what historical information can you get to quickly to try to prove the negative. And that's often something we've not seen companies practice, is understanding what logs are there, where they are, how to get to it. So if that's you, I'll take the second professorial moment here, and that's probably something you should go look at. The second piece of it is talk to your local FBI field office at a time where they're not calling you. In one, it's just a good idea generally, but the other is when these calls are coming in, it'll give you a little bit more control over who's receiving that phone call, right? Because you've opened that line, you have some familiarity, because typically the field office that's running this investigation isn't necessarily the one you're going to get called from. You're going to get called locally. So if you have some familiarity between whoever at your company you want to have that interaction and the field office, you're increasing the likelihood that that's where the call is going to be, which is going to let you better leverage all your plans and all your experience to get to a more positive outcome for your company.
And one of the things that we're seeing too is that, I know we've talked about the laptop and it gets shipped somewhere and the like. So much of the work is now done in the cloud. And so what are your controls to your cloud assets? Is your identity provider's portal only accessible by way of that system, or, as is often the case, it isn't locked down that far? So where are those logs being shipped to? How long are they being kept for? Are they all turned on? Maybe some of them aren't turned on because cost concerns, what have you. So there's a variety of different threads that we get to pull on in order to prove that negative, which is, it's really, there's a positive part to it. It's like, yeah, it does line up with DPRK work. And then there's the negative aspect of, all right, they didn't leave anything behind that's a ticking time bomb. They didn't take anything perhaps that they shouldn't have. They did only these activities. Or, you know what, we do have a larger problem here and we need to dive a little bit further. But having the logging infrastructure, running the tabletops, but really getting, not being afraid to have some lively discussions in those tabletops and challenge and pressure test whatever your teams are saying, like, hey, well, you say we can do this, show me, right? And so many times we will get into an organization, and it doesn't have to be this kind of investigation where there's the belief of how something is set up, and then there's the actuality. And the tabletops are great, lower pressure scenarios, but don't remove all the pressure, to be able to vet some of that to ensure that should one of those days come around, that you can respond to it appropriately. And we have seen Microsoft, for instance, provide its customers their own notifications showing that, hey, we've seen this kind of activity. So we've got about 4 minutes left, and I figure closing thoughts from each of the panelists, about a minute per person. So, Evan.
Just for those of you that are playing sort of a bingo, cyber bingo, I'll talk about the Cyber Maturity Modeling Certification, or CMMC, just to make sure we hit every acronym we can, because there are a lot of when you're revising your IRP, in addition to like figuring out how to spell human resources and what data they have access to, you also need to think about the back end of your IRP, your notifications. Because this could end up being a cyber incident if you have unauthorized access to your network, which is what you're having potentially. And once again, this is where you need to sort of do a lot of sort of deep thinking and speak to good lawyers. Then you might have to report this if you have regulated data, like to the Department of Defense or the U.S. government, or if you're in the healthcare sector. We talked about the SEC and all the scary places that Carolyn helps us think about. But you also have to think about sort of the other types of regulatory agencies that you need to report this to if you determine it's a cyber incident. And that's a big if there. And that's the part that I would sort of tell companies to think about. Yes, start looking for KVMs and mesh VPNs and all those things. And that's really fun to do for as sort of a technology community. But also think about sort of definitionally, what is a cyber incident? Does this trigger it? Be prepared. Think about where they are in the life cycle. We actually put together life cycles for companies of a DPRK IT worker investigation, and think about where you're going to notify and where you're not, because that's the part that you don't want to be making that up on the fly.
Yeah, I think my closing thought is we don't have any signs that this is going away, and if anything, it's spreading. Right, we're aware of other actors and others who seem to be kind of picking up this playbook. So we're not up here just from the standpoint of fear mongering, but to really kind of drive home that this is a very real threat, and it seems like it's one that's growing. So you can do well by starting to prepare now and to think through this and what it means for your organization, not just to avoid it, but also to detect it and then to act on it, and then to go practice that, because really this seems like it's a problem that organizations are going to be facing for at least the near term. So get out there, prepare and practice, and from experience that can dramatically change the level of pain that you feel and the swiftness that you can get through this.
Yeah, but we are fear mongering, so be afraid, be very afraid.
So I'll continue with the theme of being proactive. So in the sanctions context, and this really applies to all of the activity that could potentially comprise a sanctions violation, right? Is you want to try to conduct your diligence accordingly. You want to conduct your screening. You want to have in place a sanctions compliance program. These things aren't separate and apart from one another. I think we've tried to demonstrate that. Like they're all commingled, right? But sanctions, for example, might not be as obvious as some of the other considerations. There are some areas that are higher risk than others. One of the areas I think about is if you're outsourcing some of your HR work to EORs, employers of record, right? Especially if those are non-US entities. They're not necessarily aware of the sanctions, controls, and regulations that you as US companies have to abide by. And so you need to make sure, and they could be causing you to violate sanctions inadvertently, right? But that doesn't get you off the hook, right? So one of the things that is best practices is to ask questions about, are they screening? Do you need to screen? Who has responsibility for doing that vetting? That's oftentimes overlooked when you're dealing with agents of record, employers of record, unknowingly, right? And it's an easy way to try to solve for that vulnerability.
Completely agree there, and we have some wonderful stories about the gaffes that have occurred by those screening agencies. I'd say visibility, visibility, visibility. So whether it's on the endpoint, whether it's at the perimeter, or whether it's in the cloud, those are the kinds of places that we're going to be most interested in looking for. And if you are a zero trust organization, have you figured out how long it can take a trusted third party in an incident response situation onboarded and accessed to your information? Oftentimes what we'll do is struggle with the customer on getting access to the evidence. Once my folks can get their eyes on the evidence, then they can absolutely run forward with it. Knowing that you've got the right logs, that you're retaining them for a reasonable amount of time based on legal and regulatory considerations, that's what will allow us to help you in the case that you want or need to investigate something like this. And hopefully you're not in that situation, but rather you're working with sort of a sister team that we have here on just insider threat program build outs. And you'll reap the benefits, not just for the topic that we've been talking about, but the other insiders, like the one that we heard about this morning with Coinbase and employees just being bribed. And we do see that with certain organizations, whether it's somebody who's in a very hot industry like cryptocurrency, or who's simply a BPO and may have their hooks into a variety of organizations. So with that, I will not keep you from drinks any longer, and I'll have our good hostess here take us away.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you very much.